From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and in this podcast, I speak with thought leaders and peace builders who share their reflections and best practices towards achieving objectives of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa. In this episode, Mr. Michael Dunford, Regional Director for Eastern Africa for the World Food Programme, joins me from Nairobi, and we have a conversation about food security, climate change, and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Michael, is a special honor to speak with you today. Now, I'm going to start off with some pretty big numbers because according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, that's the FAO, between 720 and 811 million people in the world faced hunger in 2020, which means that between 118 and 161 million more people faced hunger in 2020 than in 2019. And fast forward to 2022, and the global food crisis is now reaching 840 million. And over a third of these are people facing hunger in Africa. Now, there are many drivers that negatively impact food security, and one of them is conflict, another is climate change, both of which impact production and the food chain value. And of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we also saw economic impacts. Now, the consequences of food insecurity is many, and the same FAO report that I cited just now said that more than 30% of women in Africa suffer from anemia because of food insecurity. And so it identifies 6 pathways to tackle trends in food security, and 2 of which are: firstly, integrating humanitarian development and peace-building policies in conflict-affected areas. And second, scaling up climate resilience across food systems. So in your experience, considering the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa, how can we practically achieve these 2 pathways?
Unfortunately, as we sit today, the situation globally with regards to food insecurity continues to deteriorate. We're in the middle of what's being described as the global food crisis, and the numbers of people that are food insecure continues to arise. We estimate that upwards of 850 million people go to bed hungry every night. In the region that I'm responsible for, we're seeing also a dramatic increase in the number of people that are acutely food insecure. Globally, this number is about 345 million. In Eastern Africa, it's between 85 and 90 million. This time last year was only at 50 million. So we've seen a very dramatic increase. And as you've indicated in your introduction, there are 4 key drivers to this. The first is conflict. Conflicts in the likes of Tigray, conflicts in Somalia, conflicts in South Sudan and elsewhere. This is causing displacement. This is causing huge levels of vulnerability, people being forced from their homes or alternatively having their ability to develop their livelihoods impacted by these rolling conflicts. The second big driver is the effects of climate. We've heard of climate change. We are now seeing on the ground climate change playing out, creating dramatic increases in food insecurity and hunger and vulnerability. Today, we're experiencing the worst drought in over 40 years across the Horn, Somalia, northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, upwards of 20 million directly impacted. And we are very fearful that unless humanitarian actors are able to scale up dramatically their response, and unless the rains break, and the forecasts are positive in that regard, we are going to see large numbers of people impacted, potentially even a famine in countries like Somalia. So the World Food Programme, along with others, are trying to address these issues head on. And we're embracing this humanitarian development peace nexus. In fact, I've just come from South Sudan, where they've turned it around and they talk about the peace humanitarian development nexus, because without peace, it's impossible to get on top of the humanitarian needs. it's impossible to address the development requirements of the population. The World Food Programme is investing heavily in this area. We've recruited staff who have this peace engagement experience and are sensitive to how we need to realign our programming to meet the needs of the situation on the ground. Equally, as it relates to climate change, we are embracing a whole range of new engagements, trying to build resilience of the communities, invest in livelihood. Importantly, starting to work with communities and governments to ensure that they are able to adapt the needs of those populations in light of the climatic shocks that are coming their way.
You said quite a lot of important things. You talked about drought and famine and the impact of climate change. So let's unpack each of those ones individually, because they're quite big topic areas. So the World Food Programme identified countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, DRC, and even Nigeria as high risk for famine. And we know that developing and maintaining conflict-sensitive food systems is really critical in addressing food security in conflict settings and some of the solutions you've talked about. And in the DRC, for example, 470,000 pregnant and lactating women are expected to suffer from acute malnutrition if they don't get the assistance needed. And you yourself have called for more work on early warning systems, increasing access to finance when triggers are heard, and facilitating access to crops and livestock insurance are some of the solutions of dealing with these crises. But my question really is, especially with those staggering numbers and the differences in just 1 year, why are we in 2022 still having to advocate for these interventions? And what are the critical ways in which you would like to see conflict-sensitive food systems better respond to the impact of conflict on women?
Yeah, one of the key elements is the high levels of vulnerability of women and children in times of conflict. We've seen this on so many occasions, that this is why there needs to be such an emphasis in this regard. Women are often forced to take responsibility for the families as the men either are drawn into the fighting. They are the ones who are responsible very often when families are displaced. It'll be the women and the children that are sent across the borders as refugees or internally displaced. There's also obviously high levels of risk of sexual exploitation and abuse for women in a conflict setting. So the World Food Programme, working with partners, is looking to see how we can best protect the women, particularly in the children. They are the ones that are most vulnerable to undernutrition, particularly, as you've mentioned, high levels of anemia if they are unable to access the right types of diets. So we have a strong emphasis on trying, first and foremost, to look at the humanitarian development work through a peace lens. How do we address those needs? How do we as WFP help to contribute to meeting the needs of the populations that are impacted by conflict? It's not that WFP necessarily is leading, but the work that we can do, building resilience, helping adaptation, developing livelihoods, and protecting the food security needs of the most vulnerable is a key component in providing a foundation and ensuring that there is a footing upon which populations can return and flourish when the conditions allow.
Based on some of the things that you said so far around food security and prioritizing peace in that process, what are some of the kind of culturally rooted issues that came out for you that you're seeing in your conversations, for example, in South Sudan, that you think you could better consider in solutions towards food security?
I think the key is trying to identify what is going to work for the communities that we are supporting. So we may have some high-level plans or programs that we would like to roll out. The key is to tailor them to the specific requirements of the communities that we are working with. And the key is to sit with the communities, to hear their stories, and to understand really what is it that they are looking from the international community and from the likes of the World Food Programme to sustain what's required to address those requirements. I was in Boma in South Tonj as recently as last week. We sat with the communities. We were asking questions. We really wanted to hear from them. What were their needs? What did they need? And how could we best respond? These are not programs that can be designed in the capital level. They can't be designed where I sit here in Nairobi. We can go with a sense of what may be suitable, but when we sit with those communities, only then do we really hear what they are looking for and how we can best meet those requirements.
We're in 2022 having similar conversations that we've been having for decades, right? You are an example of somebody that's well experienced in this area. You've worked extensively in this area, and many people like yourself, and food insecurity is not a new term. What is the missing gap here that we're not getting right still today?
First and foremost, the gap is that we still do not have peace. These conflicts continue and they rumble on for extended periods of time. That's preventing people returning to their villages. That's preventing people from recommencing their livelihoods. You know, the civil war in South Sudan was 2016. Populations have been displaced since then. We're now talking upwards of 7 years. Refugees across the border in South Sudan cannot return. They're not incentivized to return because they do not yet feel safe to do so. The populations that have remained behind are struggling to get the foothold to make the investments that they need. And so, first and foremost, we need peace. There will always be food insecurity if we have conflicts. The situation is being exacerbated now by climate change, COVID, and particularly the macroeconomic effects. And we're now seeing, in addition, the inflationary pressures that are being experienced across the globe, but are particularly impactful in many of the communities that we are working in, these countries across the region that are reliant on food imports or are reliant on support from external actors. They're really struggling at this moment.
Returning to what you said earlier on about droughts, in the Horn of Africa, there has been a 60% reduction in rainfall between March and May this year. And you have spoken about the impact of droughts in the region on families and the need for urgent humanitarian action to build that resilience of communities for the future. And droughts and the limited assistance also increase the protection risk for girls and women. And you've talked about protection risks already in relation to the placement and the movement of refugees. And earlier this year, the WFP launched a regional drought response plan for the Horn of Africa. So how have you been addressing the gendered experiences of women, where things like drought and other environmental issues compound the already exacerbated issue of food insecurity in conflict settings?
So droughts, such as the ones currently affecting the Horn, are disproportionately affect women and girls. We know this from data that's been collected over extended periods. It's estimated 85% of the 900,000 people that have been displaced in Somalia alone are women and girls. Women taking their families, looking for humanitarian assistance. Because of the insecurity in the country, they're being forced into IDP camps or are being forced from their villages. And this raises the risks. And we've seen it before, and unfortunately, the risk of sexual and gender-based violence is increased as they make these journeys, as they pass through the checkpoints, and as they attempt to seek the assistance required. So much of what WFP is trying to do is ensure that when we are designing our programs from the outset, that they are gender sensitive, that they take into account these increased levels of vulnerability that the women and the children, and particularly the girls, are experiencing, trying to ensure that they have means and mechanisms to access their humanitarian assistance without further increasing the vulnerabilities that they're exposed to. One of the challenges that we're facing, of course, is that many of the women and children are originating from hard-to-reach areas because of the long-standing civil war, because of the risk of al-Shabaab, both to the population and also to humanitarian workers. We are unable often to access the populations where they are originating from, and so we wait for them to move, and it's over these long journeys that these risks and these vulnerabilities increase. WFP has already expanded to reach 600,000 in some of these hard-to-reach areas, But we know that there is also populations that we have not been able to reach. We have put in place feedback mechanisms where all beneficiaries have the opportunity to report on any incidences that they experience as they try and access their support, be it their food or their cash. And then those reports are then fed into interagency team that is able to look at the protection requirements. There are hotlines that are manned 24 hours to ensure that they understand first and foremost what their entitlements are, but also to report back any concerns as and when they arise.
And of course, conflict is not, the existing conflicts in the world is not just situated in the Horn of Africa. The conflict in Ukraine is also having a significant impact on the global food supply. And perhaps for some of the countries, this is their first time in decades of really feeling the impact of conflict-induced food insecurity. But for countries in regions like the Horn of Africa, conflict-related food insecurity and climate-related food insecurity is an experience they've had for decades. So on the one hand, the Ukraine conflict is drawing attention, right, to food security in Western countries in a way that the average citizen perhaps is not used to being able to relate to the idea of food insecurity. But for those people in many parts of Africa for whom food insecurity is an ongoing issue, the Ukraine conflict has exacerbated the situation. So first of all, tell us some of the ways the conflict in Ukraine is impacting food insecurity in Eastern African region where you work. And then what are those actions that you would like to see happen that are not yet happening to mitigate an already dire situation from getting even worse?
The war in Ukraine could not have come at a worst possible time. That is the case at the global level, but particularly the case across Eastern Africa and the Horn. As I mentioned earlier, already levels of vulnerability were on the increase, particularly following the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which had decimated some economies across the region. Now we've got the droughts, and the war in Ukraine has pushed global prices of key commodities to levels that we have not seen in recent history. WFP has traditionally procured a lot of food for this region from the Black Sea markets. Last year, we procured 770,000 metric tons, almost $250 million worth of cereals on the Black Sea that we then use throughout our programs in Eastern Africa. As a result, with that food unavailable, we've had to go to new markets. And while today that food is available, it's coming with increased costs. So this is just adding to the overall needs for our program. And as a result, we need to continue to raise more funding. And with so much that is happening globally, the gap between our needs and our funding levels continues to expand. In this region alone, WFP needs $5.7 billion. And my expectation is that number will continue to rise into next year. We've seen that the war has impacted the ability to import. It's impacting the prices. It's also creating real concerns with regards to the availability of fertilizer. Much of the fertilizer for the region originates from both Russia and Belarus because of the sanctions regime and because of the disruption that's occurring in the supply chain. We're not seeing the same levels of fertilizer arriving in the region. This is forcing significantly up the price. It means that farmers will be using less, and that in turn is going to create a negative impact on the yields come the harvest time. So it makes a negative cycle of less food, higher costs, and I see that this is going to continue not only for the remainder of this year, but into next year as well. We have always had good support from our traditional donors, but because of the dramatic global increase in needs that we're seeing today because of the global food crisis, there's only so much money that we have been able to mobilize. Our donor for the region is the US government. They've generously contributed to our requirements. they make up almost 60%, 65% of our overall needs. But, that still leaves a significant gap between what we will be able to fundraise and what our requirements are. It means that WFP needs to make tough decisions as to how we prioritize. Most of the funding that we are receiving today is going into life-saving activities, humanitarian activities to provide the food and nutrition support to keep people alive. That means there isn't the same levels of funding required to also invest in resilience, to invest in adaptation. And yet, because of climate change and because of the increased severity and the increased frequency, we know that even when this drought breaks, there's probably another drought 3 or 4 years down the line.
Absolutely. So today we've been talking about food security, climate change, and the WPS agenda. So to finish off our conversation then, if there was one action that you would like our listeners to take today in relation to everything we've talked about, what would that be?
First and foremost, we need peace. We need the conflicts to end, because until such time, we're not going to be able to make the investments in the development and support the communities and the governments as required. But this is going to require huge investments in time, effort, and commitment from all of the stakeholders and parties. Beyond that, in addition to meeting the immediate humanitarian needs, and as I've indicated, those needs continue to increase, we also need to access new forms of funding so that we can be building the resilience and empowering populations and communities to build their own resilience. Key to this will be the role of the women, because women have huge responsibilities, but they are the ones who ultimately are the glue that bring the families and the communities together.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Yemi, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to She Stands for Peace, the podcast series where thought leaders and peace builders share their reflections and best practices in the women, peace and security agenda in Africa. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Don't forget to join the conversation using the hashtag She Stands for Peace.